Greetings, everyone, and hello. Welcome to the second panel of our symposium, The Vote, Reimagining What It Could Be. I'm Deondra Rose. I'm the Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics here at Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy. And I'm so excited to kick off our second panel today. We are discussing campaigns, voting, and equitable democracy. And I'm so excited to introduce two panelists who bring a wealth of experience in the political arena and in campaigns to this discussion. To give you a little context for those who are just joining into the symposium, we are taking time over the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, to really think big about what democratic citizenship means and where we can innovate and where there are opportunities to create more equitable democracy and to work toward universal voter participation. So a few housekeeping things. We are actually going to have a discussion with our panelists for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So please do be thinking about your questions, and please feel free to enter them in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A function in Zoom. And I will start by offering some introductions. So first we have Carlyle Gregory with us. And Carlyle Gregory brings years of firsthand experience in political campaigns, Republican organizations, and the White House to our discussion today. In 1989, he established the Carlyle Gregory Company, LLC, a Northern Virginia-based public relations and political consulting firm. Gregory began his political career in 1972 as chairman of the Virginia College Republicans. He coordinated Congressman Caldwell Butler's winning re-election campaign in 1974 and organized Virginia Congressman Paul Treble's campaign in 1976. In 1978, he managed Newt Gingrich's first successful bid for Congress and served as a field director for the National Republican Congressional Committee from 1981 through 1985. In 1987, his extensive political experience earned him a position in the White House, where he served as a special assistant for political affairs under President Ronald Reagan. As president of the Carlyle Gregory Company, he has served as a strategic consultant for dozens of political campaigns. And for Mr. Gregory's full biography, please do check out our website. You can see he just has such a fascinating and rich wealth of experience. We also have with us Professor Asher Hildebrand. Professor Hildebrand is an associate professor of the practice of public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke University. Asher teaches courses on politics and policy analysis in our MPP program. He also leads a graduate seminar on legislative advocacy, teaching students how to navigate and influence Congress. His academic interests include American politics, legislative institutions, civic participation and advocacy, democracy reform, and US foreign policy. Before he joined the Sanford faculty, Asher served for nearly 15 years in Congress and on political campaigns, holding senior leadership roles as Chief of Staff to US Representative David Price, who represents North Carolina, and as Director of Policy Research for President Barack Obama's 2012 campaign in North Carolina. Asher has also worked for International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Beirut, Lebanon, and for 2 foreign policy think tanks in Washington, DC. And so I'm really excited to introduce our panelists and so excited about the discussion that we'll have today. So welcome Asher, welcome Carlyle. How are you doing today?
Enjoying this lovely early fall weather. Thank you, Deondra, for having us.
And Carlyle, nice to see you too. How are you today? And I think you're on mute, Carlyle.
Oh, I hit the button I must not have. Okay, now I'm back. I'm okay.
Well, thank you so much. So I think, I'm going to start off with you, Carlyle, if I may. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in politics and why campaigns?
Oh, well, I wasn't expecting that question. I grew up in a political family. My dad was a city councilman. He had been the Democrat 6th district chairman at one point, although I was a Republican. And we talked politics around the dinner table. And then when I went off to college, somebody asked me to join the college Republicans, and I walked through the line. I said, well, okay. And so suddenly there I was, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's the only thing I do. I'm kind of like, I don't know how to do anything else. If you put me out on the street, I'd starve. So this is what I do, and I enjoy it. And you know, the college Republicans, we worked in political campaigns, and then I went from there to working in a local race, and then a congressional race, and then it just like I say, it just sort of stuck. And it's frankly, if anybody wants to get involved in politics, that's the way to do it. Go work in a local campaign, get involved, and if you, the great thing about politics is, well, it's not completely, but it's pretty much a meritocracy. If you do a good job, somebody's going to notice, and you're going to get hired. You're going to be able to rise in the ranks, because there's a lot of incompetence out there.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that trajectory. That's fascinating, and I'm really excited to hear more in the course of our discussion. Asher, how about you? How did you get involved in politics, and why campaigns?
Well, I guess I should start by emphasizing that my actual experience on campaigns is far less than Carlyle's. In fact, when I went to Washington as a fresh graduate, college graduate, looking to get involved, I had this notion that I wanted nothing to do with campaigns. And in fact, I wanted to be doing the real policy work, which I understood to mean working in the federal government. So I got a job in Congress, first as an intern, like many people, and then as paid staff. But I realized pretty quickly a couple of things. One was that in order to make policy, you had to wield power. And in order to wield power in a democracy, you had to win elections. And I was then working in the House minority and kind of frustrated by all of the hours of work we would put into these legislative proposals, only to have them gather dust in the hopper. And so starting in 2004 and in every election since then, I decided I would spend my my fall either volunteering on campaigns or taking leaves of absence to go work full time on them. First campaign I worked on was actually in my home district in Western North Carolina for a former football star named Heath Schuler, who was running for as a challenger against an 8-term incumbent, kind of a blue dog Democrat in a sort of what was then a swing district in Western North Carolina. And my job was to manage the 3 westernmost counties of the state, which are further away from Raleigh than they are from, I think, 5 other state capitals. So it's pretty remote territory and not particularly friendly for a Democrat. And much of my work consisted of, organizing volunteers to call voters and knock on their doors. And most of my volunteers were, lovely retired women, some men. And so it was a very kind of authentic grassroots first experience on campaigns that kind of refreshed my faith in that aspect of our democracy and made me have a greater respect for campaigns. The other thing I found valuable in working on campaigns is that I think the skill set that they help you develop really complemented the work I did in policy by giving me not only a better understanding of what actual voters are thinking and feeling, but also skills in communications and grassroots organizing and other skills that I wasn't necessarily acquiring just sitting at my desk in Washington.
Thank you so much for that, Asher. I love that overview, and also, look forward to hearing more in the course of the discussion. So just to start us off, campaigns are centrally focused on working to garner votes for a particular candidate, but I just wonder how useful is that? Like, can you give us a sense of maybe long-term trends in terms of voter participation? Are campaigns really facing an uphill battle? And maybe Carlyle, if I could start with you.
Yes, we are facing an uphill battle. I have some, I'm going to try this here for a second. I want to try to show you a chart here. Maybe I can make this work. Maybe I can. Let's see here. There we go. I'm sorry about that. That's me. How do I go to my next chart? Left, right. Didn't work. Never mind. Let me get out of that. Sorry. Well, I was going to show you a chart, but I can't show it. I'll figure it out later. But the fact of the matter is that we've got a huge number of people in this country who just don't vote. And our job is we're trying to make them vote, and they don't want to. In the 2016 election, there were 224 million people in the United States that were voting age population, and 137 million of those voted. That leaves you 90-some million people. Million. Let me repeat that. Million people that could have voted and didn't. That's a huge number. I also was looking at a study done by the Knight Foundation, and they did a lot of questions to non-voters. And one of their questions was why didn't, well, they got a number of why didn't you vote, this, that, and the other. But one of the ones I was just shocked by, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, it was, at any point in your life, has anyone ever asked you to vote? And 39% of the non-voters said no one had ever asked them to vote. That's 40% just about. So 4 out of every 10 people, somebody has never, that don't vote, nobody's ever asked them to vote. Well, that gets to what I'm trying to get at, which is that in politics over the years, we have done everything we could think of to try to get our people to vote. You know, we knock on their doors, we call them on the phone, we beat them to death on the on television. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel sorry for the poor voters. I mean, good God, all the ads. If you're living in North Carolina right now, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's like you can barely watch TV without gagging, and it's going to get worse. And the reason why is that we're all trying to find these voters and talk to them, but a bunch of them are saying they're not being talked to, or either that or they're not hearing what we're doing. Take your pick. So it is a constant struggle for us to find these voters, to communicate with them, and try to convince them to vote for our candidates. And a certain number of them just don't want to. Well, we're not talking to them in a way they understand, which I think is our fault. But I think to some extent, some of them don't want to be talked to, and that's a different issue. Asher, what do you think?
And can I actually really quickly, Asher, interject a quick follow-up, Carlyle? I mean, so one of the things I wonder about too is just how well do we, like what kind of data are we using to actually track voter participation? Do we really, have reliable means of assessing the extent to which people engage?
It's a little iffy. The census does a study after every presidential election, which I find very interesting, but it's mostly done with surveys. And the problem is, as you know, is that some people don't want to talk to us anymore. And right now, the response rate on survey research is about 6%. So that's 94% of the American public won't talk to the pollster for whatever reason. So you kind of wonder what you're really getting at. And frankly, we have a lot of trouble just putting, those statistics I gave you were rough approximations because, again, we don't really know in some cases how many people are registered to vote, and we don't know how many people, for instance, one of the reasons why there's a very low, motor voter registered a lot of people that really didn't want to register to vote. And they were doing it because they needed a driver's license or whatever, and they thought they had to do this. And so we used to have, amongst registered voters in Florida, for instance, particularly a district I worked in southern Florida, they were voting, they had an 80% turnout in a presidential election year. Motor voter came in and it went down to 65. So people were being registered and simply weren't voting. They didn't want to vote. They never intended on voting. They didn't want, put a gun to their head. They weren't going to vote. So the statistics I think are a little shaky, but there's clearly a lot of people out there that aren't registered and a lot of people that don't want to vote. One more thing I would mention, that in states that are under the Civil Rights Act law, they have a lot more trouble purging voters off the rolls. And so that has a tendency to mess up their statistics too, because they leave dead people on the rolls for years, where in other states they're able to purge them. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. Asher, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Well, I guess one thought is that it's impossible to have a conversation about voter participation without veering into a philosophical debate, because while as Carlyle says, the numerator, the number of votes cast, is relatively easy to count, not totally easy, but relatively easy. The denominator is kind of fraught with philosophical assumptions about who should be voting in the first place. And as he said, in 2016, something like 55% of the voting age population voted. But we could start with, I guess, the obvious point that for most of our nation's history, most Americans could not legally vote. And then even today, there are structural, legal, economic barriers preventing millions of Americans who want to vote from otherwise voting. And so to me, a question, any discussion about increasing voter participation sort of starts with the basic idea that if an American is of voting age, can legally vote, and wants to vote, they should be able to, right? So let's satisfy that first. Then the more difficult question is, okay, well, what about those tens of millions of people who can vote with relative ease and choose not to? How do we go about that? And that is where campaigns come in. I think we could talk more about sort of some of the specific interventions that campaigns and others have used to try to bring those people into the electorate. But maybe let me stop there and see where you want to take the conversation from here.
I want to get into that. So can we talk a little bit about some of the barriers? So Carlyle's mentioned this issue that a lot of people don't want to vote, and then Asher, I think you also underscored the fact that, there are issues related to accessibility. So for people who do want to vote, you can't always, it's not easy to do. So I'd love to hear, maybe that a discussion about the barriers and some solutions that we've developed over time, and maybe a sense of, if you have, to your mind, what would be the best practice in terms of promoting or finding a solution for low levels of engagement for voters.
Let me jump in. One of the things I thought was interesting is that in the statistical study by the census, they mentioned that 1.4 million people were in prison. Now, in some states, they can vote. Most states, they can't. So that's a hunk of people. Another issue that I was interested in, I couldn't figure out why Hawaii had such a low. I was looking through the statistics the other day, and I noticed Hawaii has a tremendously low voting percentage, low registration and low vote turnout. And I went and did a little research, and some of it is cultural. That the native Hawaiians voted a very low rate. They always have, but it's actually gotten worse for whatever reason. I mean, I don't know enough about Hawaiian politics, but the locals say it's a cultural thing, and that some of these folks weren't really happy about becoming part of the United States anyway, and it kind of spread. I don't know, but you also see that in rural parts of Appalachia and some places like that where folks just never have voted, and they don't really have this sort of sense that they ought to. And then you've got people that, and the other big thing I think that if you look around is registration. States that have same-day registration vote at a higher percentage than states that don't have same-day registration. Now, whether same-day registration is a good idea or not, we put off to one side. Probably Asher and I would disagree with that one, but it is true that they tend to have higher turnout. They also, but again, even the states like Oregon, which sends you a ballot through the mail, you don't have to ask for it; they send it to you. They still have 70% turnout. Now, of their registered voters, it's close to 75 to 80%. That's still leaving 1 out of every 5 people, adults you meet on the street, still aren't voting. That's huge. So.
Thank you so much, Asher.
So there's a political scientist that I assigned in some of my classes named Kay Schlossman, and she likes to say that there are 3 reasons why Americans don't participate in their democracy. 1, because they can't, 2, because they don't want to, or 3, because nobody asked them to, right? And we can kind of use that as a framework to think about interventions designed to increase turnout. So because they can't, meaning there are structural, legal, economic barriers preventing them to. And so again, I'm a firm believer that we should be removing as many of those barriers as possible. That could be making Election Day a holiday or moving it to a Saturday. That could be expanding early voting. That could be doing automatic voter registration, or even abolishing voter registration altogether, like the great Republican state of North Dakota, which has no voter registration, right? So removing barriers is one. Two, making people want to vote. And that conjures up a notion of kind of voter efficacy, the feeling like our vote matters. And I hope and wish that every American would have that feeling, that when they vote, their vote matters to the outcome. And in some cases, especially in small local races, 1 or 2 votes really can matter to the outcome. But it doesn't have to be about the idea that your vote's actually going to change the election. Wanting to vote can be about your sense of civic duty or patriotism. It can be about peer pressure. Your friend does it, your neighbor does it, your favorite celebrity does it, right? And so a lot of these campaigns we see to kind of make voting cool and sexy, are essentially making people want to vote more. And then finally, it may sound self-evident, but as Carlyle says, there are a lot of people who've simply never been asked to vote. And there's a kind of solid body of social science research showing that a request, especially a request from a trusted source like a friend or neighbor, is a powerful motivator for people voting. In fact, right now, the Biden campaign is running this massive national, it's called relational organizing program, right? It's a fancy way of saying everybody should reach out to their family and friends and ask them to vote. But they've created a more systematic approach to what is a pretty low-tech intervention as a way of trying to kind of increase and expand turnout. And so that request coming from a stranger, but especially coming from a trusted source, is still a very powerful reason why people choose or choose not to participate.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So sorry, Carlyle, please.
No, I was just going to say that a friend of mine who's a media consultant named Mike Murphy, he's in TV, and he said, and as you know, right now we have a tremendous amount of television advertising, and he said the reason why we're doing that is because that it's still true that a friend, particularly a good friend, giving you advice on how to vote is a big motivator. He says, of course, the problem is with a lot of Americans is their best friend is their TV. So that's the reason why he says they use all the TV, which I think is sort of funny, but there's some truth to it. The fact is, if you're running for Congress, there are 800,000 plus people in your district. If you started today, well, if you started a year ago to run around and meet them all, you could only meet a small fraction of them, no matter how hard you worked. So in political campaigns, we say, well, how can we multiply our ability of our candidate to touch voters? So we do that with TV, we do that with phones, we do that with mail, we do that with rallies. If we used to be able to do that a lot more, or events, which used to be able to do that a lot more too. But it's all part of trying to get the candidate to touch the voters in some way. And the internet's another way that we're using nowadays. And the problem is, I think, is that because we're working at it so hard, I think we ruin everything we touch. So it used to be that you would actually you'd run a poll during a political campaign, you put an ad on the air, and you'd actually see the numbers move because enough of the electorate was watching that television ad that they were being convinced by it, or the other way, sometimes you see it going down because you did a bad ad. Nowadays, you can run a gazillion ads on TV and not see any movement in the polls at all because there's so much noise and it's so hard to get through.
I want to stay on that point a little bit about the noise. I think for many people, especially, everybody out there, we're in the midst of, and here in the US, a pretty intense campaign cycle. And I think, I personally feel like I cringe a little bit when I start thinking about campaigns and campaign ads. Is there anything redeeming about campaigns? Are campaigns getting a bad rap?
Asher, why don't you start?
I mean, look, I think people have some pretty good reasons to be cynical about campaigns these days, and so I won't ascribe too much to their broader attitudes about democracy and democratic participation. I think there are many ways to participate in civic life, and campaigns are just one of them. I do think that, I guess, to mount a sort of weak defense of campaigns. I do think even in this era of kind of multi-million-dollar ad blitzes and social media disinformation wars, campaigns remain a vital form of democratic participation, and usually a pretty good experience for those involved. And they help organize the electorate. They provide voters with information. They provide a vehicle or an avenue for voters to participate beyond voting in ways that, by volunteering or by giving their money or whatever. I think the problem is that over the last decade or two, because of changes in the broader landscape in which campaigns operate, including the campaign finance landscape, including the technological landscape, and the way the tools campaigns now have available to them to reach voters and sort of micro-target them, and including the legal landscape in terms of voting rights. It's kind of metastasized into this just what feels sometimes like a death march towards election day. And so I don't begrudge the average voter for just tuning that out.
Yeah, I would add to that. Political campaigns, strategy 101 says in political campaigns is that you want to pose the question to the voters, or if you will, give them the choice between candidate A and candidate B, or we like to say jerk A and jerk B. Now, what's the difference? Well, that's what people are voting on, that they have to make a decision between this guy and that guy. And I'm just using guys, I'm using two people at the same time, but you get the idea. So if the campaign does not pose that question, then the question, the voter goes in the voter's mind is, which one do I like? Which one is prettiest? Which one do I like the best? Or which one's in my party? Which is not the way we want the decision to be made. We want the decision to be made on something better than that. I think as that they used to say that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. I mean, if you go and look at the legislature, there's a lot of people that are not very good looking. And why is that? Because they weren't elected on their looks. And a lot of times they weren't elected on their party. They were elected by what they said and the difference between them and their opponent. Jerk A versus jerk B. If jerk A wants to raise your taxes and you really hate raising tax and you really hate higher taxes, you vote for the other jerk. And so a good campaign tries to figure out what the electorate cares about and gives them that and poses that question to them. Here's your choice. Now the other campaign's doing the same thing, but still, at least that way, there's some sort of decision making that's been left to the voters, and the voters get to decide which they want. Now, the problem, of course, is that we overdo everything. But if you go down to the bottom line, most presidential campaigns, if you think about them, you could come to a choice between this candidate and that candidate was usually based on something more than the fact whether you liked them or not. Although sometimes it helped if you do like them. And I think that's strategically what a good campaign does. And we try to do. We don't always succeed.
Thank you for that. So I have to ask, as I've done campaign work in the past, really enjoyed it. It's hard work. I wonder, do you have any stories from the campaign trails to share with us? Maybe your best campaign moment, campaign folklore, like anything?
Oh dear. Well, everybody's got a bunch of stories. And I guess that I would say this, I don't know if this is a story, but I've always been very, very impressed by people that work in political campaigns as volunteers. That yes, they're sometimes hard to deal with, and yes, they've got personality issues, and yes, they're crazy sometimes. But on the other hand, they're giving up their time to work for something that's bigger than themselves. And sometimes they're sacrificing tremendous amounts of time and sometimes money for something they believe in. And you can't help but admire that. Even if they're whacked out, even if some of the things they believe are just crazy, but still there they are. And they're going out in the middle of the night and putting up signs, and they're knocking on doors, which is, some of us, I'm one of them. I don't like meeting new people, You go knock on somebody's door and try to talk to them or call them on the phone and they don't want to be talked to. That's hard. It's real hard. I'm working with an organization right now that has knocked on 1.9 million doors in this country. And you think about that, that's really hard.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. Asher, anything else to add?
Well, I was hoping for Newt Gingrich anecdotes from Carlyle, but we'll have to save those for next time. I'll offer a couple. I mean, one is just, again, back to that first race that I went out into the field for, in Western North Carolina. And this is 2006. And if, modern techniques and technologies had already arrived, it was not evident in the 3 counties where I was. And so much was just old style campaigning, which, I rolled my eyes at, but also kind of appreciated. So, for example, I remember making a stop with the candidate's campaign manager by the local sheriff's office, who happened to be a Democrat. And for those of you not from the South, I mean, sheriffs in North Carolina and some other southern states wield probably a disproportionate amount of power and often see themselves as kind of above the law as the most senior elected law enforcement officials in the county. And that's problematic for other reasons, but in this case, we went and visited the local sheriff. It was maybe 11 o'clock in the morning. They pulled out a flask, started passing it around, and the sheriff said, "So just tell me where you need all your yard signs, bring them to me. I'll have my guys get in their squad cars and go out and put them in all the yards." And this is me, having this idealistic version of what democracy was. I was thinking also of my experience in the 2012 Obama campaign when I was the policy director, which was a fancy title. As it turns out, in a re-election campaign for a president, there's not all that much policy to be made. So it was mostly a communications role. But as the election drew closer, really me and everybody else in the campaign, our jobs kind of morphed into the same shoe leather grassroots stuff that everybody else was doing. And I remember the night before the election, I drove down to Charlotte for an event that the First Lady was doing at a hangar at the Charlotte airport to fire up the crowd on the night before the election. And she was being introduced by Mariah Carey, who had brought her 2 children with her, and someone had to babysit them. And so I was around and, started playing with her kids. And I remember thinking, I'm the policy director for a presidential race, and it's the night before the election, and I am babysitting Mariah Carey's children. It's not what I signed up for, but also it's just, kind of the nature of campaign, where everybody's just got to step up and do whatever they need to do.
That is awesome. I have to say, I wasn't expecting that, Asher. I mean, you definitely have had a brush with fame, I'm sure, on many levels. So I have 2 more questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. There are a couple of questions that are coming in the Q&A function. So please, attendees, feel free to add your questions to the list, and we'll give them to Carlyle and Asher. So first, I just want to ask, to go back to Carlyle's point about some of the challenges that campaign workers face, because people are increasingly, or they're decreasingly inclined to engage with people who come to their doors, or with people who call them on the phone and want to talk. Like you said, I mean, who does that? So, I mean, I noticed that at Duke, for example, students are working on text campaign, text banking. Are there, to your mind, how might campaigns need to pivot to account for where the public is these days? I think in many ways we have kind of a mid-20th century approach, or we think of that in terms of classic campaigns. Are campaigns keeping up with society and the culture and what people will or will not do?
Well, I think they are, but like I said, or mentioned earlier, I think we kill everything we touch. I think we've got ruined TV, and we've ruined the phones, and we're getting ready to ruin the internet now. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been a clear uptick in the number of text messages one receives nowadays that are garbage. And my home phone and my office phone only ring when somebody's trying to sell me something. I mean, I think I must get one real call a month now. So we're killing that too. And we'll kill the text messaging. We'll get to the point where people won't even want to read those either. Right now, they're working very well. And the internet digital advertising works okay. And we're spending more and more money on that. But I think that's more of a function. Now, Asher, you may disagree with this, but we've got so much money in the system now, we can't find stuff to spend it on. I live in Northern Virginia. I live in tucked right underneath Washington, D.C., and there are campaigns downstate that are buying Washington, D.C. media just because one or two of their small counties received that message. And 20 years ago, that would have been nuts. What a waste of time. I'm spending $gazillion to talk to 5% of the electorate. But now we're doing it because there's so much money. And I don't think we're creative enough to figure out how to spend it very well. I still think, well, let me put it this way. It's not more think. I think we have some studies that show this, that still the most influential hit or contact, if you will, is a real person talking to another real person. And that is what we don't do very well nowadays in politics. And any way you can make your message more personalized and more individualized, the better. So I think we could spend a lot more time and money recruiting people to talk to other people and getting them to knock on their doors, or even contact them on the internet or whatever than we're doing now. And, you know, Asher was talking about how the Biden campaign is trying to do that, and all the big campaigns are trying to do it. We don't do it that well, I don't think.
Thank you so much, Carlyle. But Asher.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Carlyle both that there's so much money in the system that campaigns are not forced to spend it efficiently. I mean, the Center for Responsive Politics just estimated that there will be almost $12 billion spent in the 2020 election at all levels. And that is a 50% increase from 2016. That's also more than the GDP of almost 50 nations, right? And almost half of that is just in the presidential race. So there is just so much money sloshing around the system that is going to some inefficient purposes. But I would actually say that, you know, despite popular perceptions of campaigns maybe sometimes being a little antiquated in their approach, there is some extremely well-funded, sophisticated, and I think at times morally dubious campaign strategy happening right now, and it's happening online. I mean, what campaigns have today that they didn't have 20 or even 10 years ago is one, massive, sophisticated databases of voter information, not just voting information, but all kinds of consumer information. They have two, powerful artificial intelligence and predictive analytics that can create profiles of voters and figure out exactly what message is, in theory, most likely to move voters. Doesn't always get it right, but it's scary what they can do. And then three, they've got a proliferation of platforms on which they can reach voters with surgical precision. And of course, we think of the big tech companies and platforms, the Facebooks and Twitters, but there are hundreds or dozens of social media sites that you've never heard of. And then the campaigns themselves, especially the Trump campaign this year, is building its own infrastructure of what could, I think, accurately be called fake news websites to also reach voters and get the news to them. In fact, I'm trying to pull up a statistic here. So I think it was July or August, the Biden campaign was running 573 unique advertisements on 427 different online platforms. Sounds like a lot. The Trump campaign was running over 40,000 unique advertisements on 63,000 different online platforms, right? And those ads are not broad-based. They are appealing to the interest, the motivation, the habits of individual voters, either to get them to vote for Trump, which morally I think is okay, right? It's just sort of taking to an extreme what we've been doing all along in campaigns. But in many cases, they're also trying to discourage voting by the other side, try to, in some cases, sow disinformation, whether it's about voting by mail or anything else. And so that's where you're really getting into uncharted territory here on the internet. I don't want to overstate sort of the impact that will have on an individual campaign, on the outcome of the campaign, because there are still some powerful fundamentals at play, right? But it is far past anything we've ever done. The other thing I'll mention just briefly is that the New York Times reported that the RNC is spending $60 million just on digital get out the vote program, which just to put that amount in perspective, in 2016, the RNC spent less than $3 million on the same type of program, right? And there too, it's targeting voters where they are, trying to get them to vote. And so it is just, it's mind-blowing what's happening on the internet right now.
You know, so I'm thinking a lot about COVID-19 and our current status, which actually makes a lot of the classic approaches to campaigns, doing that sort of one-on-one in-person connection, going door to door, canvassing, difficult. And so we've seen that, as you've mentioned a number of techniques that campaigns have used to pivot to this moment. And I just wonder, do you think that this will accelerate change in campaigns, toward a future that looks very different from that classic mode of connecting? So might there be things that we see going on right now as a result of this pivot that stay in our landscape of campaigning?
I don't know. Yeah, why don't you go
Carlyle.
ahead? No, you go first.
I mean, I think as with so many things in our society, this disruption caused by the pandemic has the effect of accelerating some trends that were already underway, and that there will probably be some correction, but that some of it will be sticky, right? So campaigns were already moving to digital organizing in a major way, and already prioritizing TV about anything else. So some of that's not necessarily going to change. I do hope, not just because of some sentimental attachment, but because I think it's good for democracy, I hope that there is a kind of return to face-to-face, person-to-person, connection on campaigns. And I feel very comfortable with the idea that we could use sophisticated technologies and predictive intelligence to reach voters and then have a human call them and talk to them, right? I have no problem with that. But I have a lot more issue with the idea that, that the human gets cut out of the mix entirely, and it's just ad makers targeting their ads to people based, and sort of creating this almost alternative reality where people are only exposed to, to whatever information lives in their Twitter feed and in their inbox. And that's what kind of terrifies me about the current moment.
And Carlyle, I want to get your input on this one too, but really quickly, just a quick follow-up on Asher's point. Asher, I guess one of the things I'm thinking is, you say we don't want to sort of pull the person out of this equation, out of this exchange, but I think we're also seeing a context where people really don't want to engage. I think, to Carlyle's earlier point, for many people, they don't want to have somebody come and talk to them face to face. And so I just wonder, is there a unique problem to democracy? Like, is it, I don't want to, make it dramatic and say that democracy hurts for some people, but, is there sort of a parallel situation that we need to address where people don't have the bandwidth or the inclination to engage in that way? And yet that's what democracy at its best might require.
Yeah, my response is a values-based response and not necessarily an evidence-based response. But I think it's a chicken and the egg situation where, campaigns done right with ordinary citizens organizing their communities to participate in elections, including knocking on doors, calling them, yes, texting them, and using some other advanced technologies too, where that can actually help rebuild trust in democracy and trust in institutions, and that the stuff that's turning them off is probably the blitz they're seeing on the airwaves, or some of the other things that they're being exposed to. And so that might be aspirational, but I guess it's how I feel about it.
Well, thank you for that aspiration, Asher. Carlyle, I want to hear your perspective on this one.
Well, I think Asher's right. Well, he's right on several points. But when he talked about the fact that the political campaigns are getting more and more sophisticated, I think that is right. And part of that is because we've been forced to, because some of the things that we used to do just didn't work. We used to be able to call people and they would talk to us on the phone. I was in college Republicans at Washington Lee a zillion years ago, and we would get we had two phones at the headquarters, and one of us would get on the phone, the other, or actually both phones, and you just call people and you'd ask them some questions, and they would talk, and sometimes they would be excited about it. So, oh, that's great. Nobody ever calls me and asks me my opinion. It's hard to imagine this world now that used to be that way, and that wasn't that long ago. And now, like I said, I think our polling gets more screwy all the time. I think because we're guessing a lot, because we're getting 6% of the electorate is actually talking to us, and I think those 6% are self-selected. I think they're the people that want to talk to the pollsters. The other 94% don't want to talk to the pollsters. So how can that be representative of the electorate? I don't know how, but on the other hand, I think we are learning to some extent that personal contact, or relearning, if you will, personal contact makes a big difference. And actually in this environment, door-to-door actually works better than it used to, because there are more people at home. We're knocking on doors and finding more people there. Now they won't answer the phone, but if somebody knocks on the door, it's still a fairly rare event. And a certain number of people will talk to you at the front door that wouldn't talk to you on the phone. So I think we'll keep experimenting. We'll keep, here's another thing too. I know that, you buy something online and you suddenly get advertisements for it all the time, right? You buy a fountain pen online, and every day I get an ad, 3 or 4 ads about fountain pens. I've bought my fountain pen. I'm not interested in another fountain pen, but they're spending gazillions of dollars trying to get me to buy them some more fountain pens, because that's what the computers now say. I think, yes, we've gotten very sophisticated in the way we target people, and we target them digitally, but I'm not sure how much of that actually works. And I don't have a good measurement for it. I know that I never look at any of the banner ads on Facebook. I just never look at them. I couldn't tell you one, and I will notice when it's obnoxious maybe, and I'll say, oh, that's really obnoxious, but I'm not going to buy it, and I'm not going to vote for it. So I think we're still learning on that stuff. And the good news is that people still will surprise you. They will vote in odd ways. You run into people, and I remember I was working in a campaign. I'm a Republican. I was working in a Republican campaign in Northern Virginia, and this guy walks in. This was 30 years ago. And this guy walks in. He's got earrings. He's got tattoos. He's got a scalp lock. All right, I mean, it's like that thing, and he's just a really weird-looking guy to me, particularly 30 years ago. He walks in the campaign headquarters, and he wants to talk to me about the Laffer curve, which is and the guy's a right-wing conservative. I mean, it was so surprising. My jaw dropped. But I, on the other hand, you sort of listen to his hype. I remember walking in a campaign, you go back to Newt, and somebody came in and wanted to talk to me about nuclear proliferation. So a voter off the street, huh? So people are interesting, and they're not all. We don't all fit in those little square pegs, and sometimes we're the round hole, and you're the square peg. And so I think that there's still lots of room for us to talk to voters, and I think our challenge is to be more interesting and to be more persuasive. And I don't think volume is how we solve that problem. And I think that's what most people do, because it's easy. We're like the World War I generals, say, well, gee, we did a frontal assault and all our guys got killed. So let's do another frontal assault. This time we'll use more people, and more people will get killed. And they kept doing that over and over again, and it's like they never learned anything from it. I think our job is to learn from what we're doing and to try to change what we're doing and try to talk to voters where they live. It's hard.
Thank you so much. I love that. All right, so I want to open it up to the floor for questions, and we've got a couple in the question box. So I'll start with one from Scott. So this will actually connect with a lot of what we've been discussing related to in-person and person-to-person contact with campaign staff. And so at the end of Scott's question, he asks, what effect do you think that the pandemic will have on overall turnout in 2020, given that there's been less face-to-face contact? You know, again, presuming that, I guess there's also this question of whether when campaigns do canvass and they're meeting people at home, they're able to make contact. So I'm just curious, and to Scott's question, what effect do you think the pandemic will have on overall turnout this time around?
Well, go ahead, Asher. Oh, you're gonna make me go first. You know, we don't know. We really don't know. So what we're all doing is we're all working on voter turnout like madmen because we're worried about people that are worried about going out and voting. And so, you know, people are pushing early voting, people are pushing mail voting. And we've seen an increase in early voting and we've seen an increase in mail voting. What we don't know yet is whether that's going to have any overall impact on the voting at the end. You know, one of the things they figured out in some of the early voting states that have a lot of early voting, like North Carolina and Tennessee, vote more than 60% early. I mean, 60% of the voters are voting early. But it didn't have any impact on the overall turnout. In other words, just because they voted early didn't mean that more people were going to vote. It had a smidgen, maybe a percentage point or two. And the other thing that's sort of interesting to me is that when you have an election like when Barack Obama was the nominee and everybody talked about how big the turnout was, and you go back and look at the numbers, and it was about 1.5% more than the previous presidential election. And it was a big turnout, but it wasn't tremendously bigger. And everybody says this is going to be a big turnout election because everybody's so mad. They might be right. But my guess is it'll be maybe a percentage point or two higher than it was last time, and that's about it. And I think most people, you know, have gotten so many opportunities to vote by mail if they want to. I think they're taking them. So that's my opinion. We'll find out, won't we?
We sure will. How about you, Asher?
Yeah, you know, it's tempting to see 2020 as kind of a natural experiment in how much campaigns actually matter, because there hasn't been much in the way of what we would normally recognize as a campaign for much of the year, especially on the Biden side. Trump's done more of the kind of conventional rallies and you know, voter contact and all of that. And I'll save my commentary on how reckless some of that's been for another time. But and this is a big but, I mean, there is just so much exceptional about this year, you know, both in terms of the motivation on both sides that voters are feeling and how fired up they are and how willing they are to risk even their health and lives to cast their ballots. And countervailing that, just the very real logistical difficulties of voting during a pandemic, combined with the very confusing legal situation that's been created by some pretty systematic attempts to restrict and challenge the ways people can vote, including here in North Carolina. And so I just think it's impossible. We should not overlearn the lessons of 2020. And I hope to God that it is an aberration, because we have to go through this too many more times. We might not survive.
Thank you so much.
I would also say this. You know, I think as good Americans and Democrats with a small d, we want people to vote. We do want people to vote, but we also, I think, need to keep in mind that every time we make it easier to vote, we also increase the percentage likelihood of fraud. And everybody kind of forgets this. I remember my first campaign, I worked for a guy named Carlyle. He was running for Congress, re-elect. And I was driving him around. I was in college at the time. And I said, you know, we really ought to make it easier for college students to vote absentee. And he jumped all over me. Okay, I remember this guy. I still remember this today. I mean, like 40 years ago. I was like, but because the point he was making was, he started talking about the history of it in Virginia. And there were counties in Virginia in the 30s and 40s and even in the 50s that would vote more people absentee than people lived there. Because it was so easy, and they made it very tough. They probably went too far, but they made it very tough to vote absentee in Virginia because of that. And you had the same sort of problems in some of the cities where they were stuffing ballot boxes. The election of 1960, pretty clear there was vote fraud in Texas and Illinois, and those were pivotal states. How much did it make a difference? That's a different question. We could ask about it later. But one of the things there's a little bit of fraud that takes. I mean, people do things, and that's a little here and a little there. Who cares? What you don't want is organized fraud, and that's the thing that I think we want to make sure that our laws are tough enough that they keep that from happening. And I just don't want to go too far in the other direction, where when people can wander into the polls and vote 3 or 4 times. Because I don't know if you ever read that book, The Last Hurrah, about this Boston politician, but there's a guy in the book, I think they call him Fast Eddie or something. And they call him Fast Eddie because he runs on election day, he runs from poll to poll and votes at each one of them. And his record was like voting 24 times. He wanted to see if he could beat it that year. You don't want that to happen. So Asher and I may disagree on this. I don't think anybody should be systematically stopped from voting, and I don't think we should discourage people from voting. But I also think there need to be some safeguards to keep illegal voting from happening. Because if you vote illegally twice and I vote legally once, you've canceled my vote. You've basically deprived me of my vote, and I just don't think we should allow that sort of thing to happen. But again, I don't think vote suppression is a very bad thing. Nobody should be for it.
Asher, did you have a point to add there?
Oh, only that Carlyle is right that we disagree on it, and that I think the evidence shows that today, maybe not 50 years ago or 60 years ago, but today fraud is extraordinarily rare. Of course, it's not non-existent. We saw an episode of election fraud, not voter fraud, but election fraud in North Carolina's 9th congressional district just last year.
Right.
And the General Assembly, in a bipartisan manner, changed some laws to try to respond to that. So it's not that it's non-existent, but it just the kind of systematic, high-level incorporation of an anti-fraud message into the president's re-election campaign is so disproportionately, out of touch with the reality that it's just hard for me to. It's hard for me to say that that we should force voters to choose between voting and their health, first of all, but it's also hard for me to I guess take at face value the president's professed concern over fraud when even Republican elections officials are around the country are saying, no, in fact, voting by mail is safe. We need people to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know we have other questions, so we can move on to those.
Well, and I should say our time is just about up. And so if I may, for a very quick lightning round for our panelists, ask the 2 final questions to put them out there. And this could be things for our audience to continue thinking about. And I'd love to see if the panelists might have a 15-second response to this, and I'll put them together. But Ryan really has remarked that we've talked a lot about, making people want to vote. But what about this reverse of making campaigns and the electoral process more compelling to voters? So one, how might we go about doing that? And then Lolita asks about how might campaigns work to create more sustained civic engagement. So oftentimes we focus on the short term, but is there anything that we might do to have a more long-term effect? So if you have thoughts on either of those for a lightning round.
The Knight Foundation, again, one of those things on their study I really liked is they asked people that don't vote why they didn't vote. And the number one reason was 17% said because they didn't like the candidates. The second reason was that their vote didn't matter. So those are two things we might be able to do something about. Better education and maybe better candidates.
Thank you, Carlyle. Asher?
Yeah, my 15-second answer is just a couple of specific reforms I would support, Ryan. One is ranked choice voting. Some states are now incorporating that, beginning to experiment with it. Some localities, that tells the voter that even if your first choice isn't counted, you'll have a chance to have, you know, a second choice counted perhaps, and that maybe would create a greater sense of efficacy. And then another is public financing of campaigns, which would, among other things, reduce the barriers to allow more socioeconomically diverse candidates to run in elections, but also would just help address just the you know, money sloshing around the system that we talked about earlier. Problem with public financing is that it's pretty unpopular by voters because they see it as welfare for politicians, but it has worked in our country before. There's a history of it, and I'd like to bring it back. And then very quickly to Lolita's
Bad for
point,
consultants.
and for consultants, that's right. Very quickly to Lolita's point, you know, I really think that this is a role that political parties used to play, especially in their local organization. And both because of some decisions the parties themselves made to kind of unilaterally disarm, but also because of voters declining interest in participating in parties, that they no longer play that role in many places. And so I don't know exactly what the solution is. I'm kind of attached to the idea of, you know, reviving the local party infrastructure. And I think we have seen a little of that in recent years, especially in the Trump era, of people choosing to engage back with the parties that didn't before. But I agree that that sort of continuous engagement, that constant presence, that doesn't just show up, you know, a few months before a presidential election, is vital to sustaining that kind of civic lifeblood that we're talking about today.
Asher, Carlyle, I can't thank you enough. I'm sure the audience agrees. We could go on talking forever with you two about this fantastic topic. Thank you so much for being with us and being a part of our symposium. We're so grateful for your time and your willingness to share your insights. Thank you to all of the participants in the audience. Thanks for being with us. We hope that you will join us again in an hour. We'll be right here, same place at 1:30 to talk about fresh perspectives. Innovative solutions for increasing voter engagement. We'll have panelists who can discuss a number of different sort of bold ideas to promote greater civic engagement, political engagement, including, as Asher pointed out, rank order voting. We have someone who's actually heading up a campaign in Massachusetts. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Fun. Thank you.
Bye, Carlyle.
Good to meet you.